What's worse than the whole world hating you? Maybe you've felt it before. That cold sting of rejection, of being judged, of having an entire crowd turn its back on you. The feeling that your own name has become a curse on other people's lips. It's painful. It's isolating. But let me ask you a question that might cut a little deeper. What's even worse than that? I'll tell you. It's when the one person in the world you're supposed to love, the one who shares your blood, hates you too. And the worst part is that they are completely, utterly justified. It's your fault. That's not isolation anymore. That's a special kind of hell. Tonight, I want to invite you on a journey, not to some distant fairy tale land, but to a dusty street corner where a man named Levi was living in that very hell. Levi had everything the world craves: a marble villa overlooking the sea, the finest silk robes, and enough power to crush a man's life with a single dismissive frown. He was a titan of wealth, a monument to success. But to the entire city of Capernaum, he was public enemy number one. A traitor, a leech feeding on his own people. And our story doesn't stop there, because Levi's greatest crime wasn't written in his tax ledgers. It was carved into the broken heart of his younger brother, a crime that had shattered a family. You might think you know how this story goes. A bad man meets a holy man and everything changes. But I promise you, what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about forgiveness. The twist in this story isn't whether Levi finds redemption, but the terrifying price of that redemption. It will not happen the way you think. Not at all. And before we turn the first page of this painful yet hopeful story, I want you to do something for me. Just for a second, look around. In the comments below, tell us where in the world you're listening from right now and what time is it for you. It's an amazing thing to know that no matter where we are in any time zone, we can all be connected by a single story. All right, are you ready? Take a deep breath, because we are about to step into Levi's gilded cage. The walls of Levi's villa were made of the purest white marble, shipped from the farthest quarries of the Roman Empire. They were cold, so cold, they seemed to leach the warmth right out of the air. Every step Levi took on the polished floors echoed unnervingly, a constant hollow reminder of the infinite emptiness of the space. This was not a home. It was a beautifully decorated tomb. Every evening, the long cedarwood table was set for one. The finest delicacies, the most aged wines, exotic fruits brought in by caravan, but it all tasted like ash. Levi would sit there alone in a silence so profound it was louder than the jeers and curses he endured every time he stepped outside. He could buy anything except a flavorful meal. He could command dozens of servants, but he couldn't command a single genuine smile. By day, Levi was a predator. He sat in his office surrounded by scrolls and ledgers, his world a matrix of numbers and names. He calculated, he strategized, he found loopholes in the law to squeeze more and more unreasonable taxes from his own countrymen. He knew precisely how to bankrupt a fisherman after one bad season. He knew how to make a farmer sell his ancestral land over a trivial debt. His power was absolute. He was the human face of Roman oppression, a Jew who served as the empire's tool to bleed his own nation dry. And he was ruthlessly good at it. But when night fell, the predator would return to his gilded cage and become the prisoner. Levi would often wander through the cavernous rooms, his fingers tracing the patterns on Persian rugs, his eyes gazing at Greek pottery. He had built this empire brick by brick, coin by coin, but he was coming to a bitter realization. He didn't own these things. They owned him. They were his silent jailers, locking him away in a prison of opulence and guilt. Some nights he would stand at the grand window, looking out at the Sea of Galilee shimmering under the moonlight. He'd see the tiny fishing boats, hear the faint sounds of laughter as the fishermen worked together, pulling in their nets. They were poor, they struggled, but they had each other. They had community. They had the one thing all of Levi's gold could never buy: and a sharp, acidic envy, an ache so constant it had almost become a part of him, would tighten its grip around his heart. That ache had a name: Aaron. Levi's greatest sin wasn't what he had done to the city of Capernaum. His greatest sin, the festering wound that would never heal, was what he had done to his own younger brother. They had been boys together, growing up in their father's small carpentry workshop. The scent of fresh pine, the rhythmic sound of the saw and chisel, that was the symphony of their childhood. Aaron had the hands of an artist. He could see a soul in a block of wood and bring it to life. Levi, on the other hand, had the mind of a businessman. They had once dreamed of a future together, of building their father's workshop into a legendary enterprise. But then their father died, and greed, like a toxic weed, began to sprout in Levi's heart. He didn't want to share, he wanted it all. He studied Roman law, the very law his people despised. He found a loophole, a subtle clause. With paperwork that was cruelly legal, with a cunning that Aaron's artistic soul could never comprehend, Levi took everything. The workshop, the inheritance. He had cast his own brother out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on his back and a shattered heart. Now Aaron lived in a tiny, dilapidated house in a poor alleyway. He was still a carpenter, but instead of creating art, he struggled to mend broken chairs and build simple tables just to feed his wife and small children. Every day, the knowledge of Aaron's struggle was a ghost that haunted Levi. It whispered in his ear when he put on his fine robes. It mocked him as he sat at his lonely banquet table. This wasn't just guilt. It was a sentence Levi had passed on himself, a life sentence in the prison of his own wealth and solitude. He had won the battle for an inheritance, but in doing so, he had lost the war for his own soul, and deep down, he knew it. Levi wasn't a complete monster, or at least he tried to tell himself he wasn't. Remorse gnawed at him, not as a catalyst for change, but as a chronic, low-grade fever of the soul. He couldn't face Aaron. He couldn't bring himself to apologize. His pride, the fortress he had built so high, wouldn't allow it. So he did the only thing a man like him knew how to do. He threw money at the problem. Once a month, under the cover of darkness, a trusted servant would sneak into the alley where Aaron lived. The servant would leave a heavy leather pouch on the doorstep. No note, no message, just the cold, hard glint of silver coins. It was a fortune, enough for Aaron and his family to live comfortably for months, enough to buy the finest tools, enough for his children to have new clothes. Levi thought of it as restitution. He thought he was making amends. He thought money could patch the wounds he had inflicted. He was wrong. Aaron knew where the money came from. He could smell the stench of his brother's guilt and arrogance on every coin. The first time it happened, he looked at the pouch, then at the weary eyes of his wife, at his sleeping children. There was a moment of temptation, but then he shook his head. The next morning, instead of going to the market, instead of fixing his leaking roof, Aaron took the entire pouch to the synagogue. He said nothing of its origin. He simply handed it to the elders and said, "Please use this for the widows and orphans of our city. They need it more than I do." That news, as it always did, found its way back to Levi. And each time it was a physical blow to his pride. Aaron's rejection was more painful than any curse. It was a defiant, silent, and resounding declaration. "My dignity is not for sale. Your charity cannot wash away your sin. You can buy the world, but you cannot buy back my soul." Levi's ultimate power, his money, was rendered utterly worthless before the one person he most wanted to influence. His attempts at redemption were rejected. He was trapped. He realized he could build a wall of gold that reached the heavens, but it would never be high enough to hide the truth of his own spiritual bankruptcy. He was a king ruling a kingdom of ashes, a kingdom with a population of one, himself. Desperation began to tighten its grip. He tried everything. He threw more lavish parties, but the guests were only sycophants, business partners with plastic smiles. He bought more priceless artifacts, but they only made his villa feel colder. He buried himself in his work, becoming even more ruthless, but the busyness was only a temporary anesthetic. When night came, the ghost of Aaron would return, sitting at the foot of his bed, watching him with silent, judging eyes. And then, in the deepest part of the darkness, a whisper began to spread through Capernaum, a whisper about a man from Nazareth. At first, Levi dismissed it. Another wandering preacher, another round of empty promises. He'd heard it all before. But this whisper was different. It didn't just speak of powerful sermons, it spoke of the impossible. They said this man, Jesus, had made the blind see, the lame walk. But that wasn't what seized Levi's attention. What made his calloused heart stir was a different detail, one recounted with a mixture of awe and sometimes disapproval. They said this man, he ate with sinners. He spoke to tax collectors. He touched the outcasts. And then Levi heard a phrase, a story passed from village to village. They said that Jesus didn't just heal bodies. He had the power to rewrite life stories. Rewrite life stories. The phrase lodged itself in Levi's mind. His life story was a tragedy, a tale of greed, betrayal, and inescapable loneliness. He was the villain of his own narrative, and the idea that someone somehow could take the stained, blotted book of his life and write a different final chapter, a chapter with hope, a chapter with redemption. The idea was both insane and irresistible. A tiny spark of hope, as thin as a spider's thread, ignited in the darkness of his soul. It wasn't a roaring fire, just a single glowing ember, but in a place as cold as Levi's heart, even an ember has an incredible power to warm. Curiosity became an obsession. He sent his spies and informants out, instructing them to listen for any news of Jesus. He wanted to know everything. What did he look like? What did his voice sound like? And most importantly, were the whispers true? Then one day, the urgent news arrived. Jesus was on his way to Capernaum. He would be passing through the city that very day. In that moment, Levi knew he couldn't stay put. The skepticism, the fear of ridicule, the mountain of pride, it all crumbled before a more powerful urge. He had to see this man. He didn't need a miracle. He didn't dare ask for forgiveness. He just needed a glimpse. He just needed to know if, in the eyes of the one who could rewrite life stories, his own story was truly, finally, and irrevocably over. He bolted from his office, not even bothering to change out of his work tunic. He had to go. Now, the streets of Capernaum were in chaos. The news of Jesus' arrival had turned the city into a roiling river of humanity. People poured into the main thoroughfare, pushing, shoving, craning their necks for a better view. Mothers held up their children. Old men leaned on their staffs. The sick looked on with desperate hope, all of them forming a great yearning sea of faces. When Levi emerged, a wave of silence and contempt radiated out from him. The crowd parted, not to make way for him, but to create a repulsive vacuum, a circle of pure rejection. Whispers followed him like stinging insects. Look, the leech. The traitor is here too? I suppose he means to tax the prophet. Levi tried to ignore it. For the first time, the insults didn't matter. He had one goal, to get through. But the crowd was an impenetrable wall. He was short of stature, and he was despised. Every time he tried to squeeze into a gap, a sharp elbow or a fiery glare would push him back. He was an island of damnation in an ocean of people. He stood on his tiptoes, straining to see over the heads, but it was useless. A sense of despair began to wash over him. He was so close, yet impossibly far. This human wall was the perfect symbol for his life. Always on the outside, always blocked, always rejected. And then, in his desperation, his eyes scanned his surroundings. He saw it. A low, flat-roofed house right on the edge of the road where Jesus would pass. A crazy, humiliating idea, an idea born of sheer desperation, flashed in his mind. Climb it. A man of his status, one of the wealthiest men in the city, climbing a house like a common child, a thief? His pride screamed in protest, but the yearning in his heart screamed louder. If no one will make a way for me, then I will make my own. He stopped thinking. He just acted. He shrugged off his expensive outer cloak, letting it fall to the dusty ground without a second thought. In his simpler tunic, Levi started for the house. He skirted the edge of the crowd, ignoring the looks of astonishment and the first ripples of mocking laughter. "Look at him, what is Levi doing?" He grabbed onto the rough-hewn stones of the wall, his movements clumsy and awkward. His expensive leather sandals slipped. His soft hands, used to holding gold and silver, were scraped raw by the stone and mortar. Dirt and grime stained his clothes. It was not a dignified sight. It was the sight of a man sacrificing every last shred of his public dignity for one final chance at hope. When he finally pulled himself onto the flat roof, he was panting, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could feel hundreds, thousands of eyes on him. He was a spectacle, a fool, but from up here he could see. He could see the road, he could see the crowd, and then he saw him. In the middle of the clamoring sea of people, Jesus walked with an extraordinary peace. He was not tall or physically imposing. He wore no grand robes, but there was an authority that radiated from him, a light that seemed to dim everything else around him. Levi held his breath. His heart seemed to stop. He had done the most humiliating thing in his life. Now all he could do was wait. Jesus was getting closer. Levi could see his face now, his eyes. He watched as Jesus paused to speak to a child, to smile at an old woman. Levi's heart beat a desperate rhythm against his ribs. "See me, just once, please, just see me." And then the impossible happened. Just as he was directly below the house where Levi sat, Jesus stopped. Not a casual pause, a dead stop. The entire crowd around him seemed to halt with him confused. A strange silence fell over that section of the street. And then, slowly, deliberately, Jesus lifted his head. His gaze didn't scan the crowd. It didn't look at the sick who were calling out to him. It shot through the air, past all the noise, and locked onto a single point, onto Levi. In that instant, Levi's world didn't just shatter. It was remade, to be seen. For the first time in his life, he felt truly seen. Not as Levi the tax collector, not as Levi the traitor, but just as Levi, a man. There was no contempt in that gaze, no judgment. There was a profound, soul-deep understanding, as if this stranger knew every secret, every pain, every silent tear he had ever shed. Levi froze. He forgot how to breathe. He braced himself for a public rebuke, for a shaming in front of the entire city. But then Jesus spoke, and his voice, not loud but carrying like thunder, struck the very core of Levi's soul. Levi. To hear his name spoken, not with hatred, but with a strange, unnerving familiarity, broke something open inside him. Tears welled in his eyes. How does he know my name? Levi held his breath, waiting. He had imagined this moment. He would invite Jesus to his villa. He would throw the grandest feast Capernaum had ever seen. He would show him his influence, his wealth. That would be his way of showing honor. But the words Jesus spoke were not the ones he expected. He said a single sentence, a command that changed everything. "Levi, come down." And then the terrible twist was delivered. "Today you will lead me to Aaron's house." If the previous silence had been strange, the silence that followed this statement was absolute death. The air itself seemed to solidify. 1,000 people, Levi included, simultaneously thought they had misheard. To whose house? Aaron's. The name spoken from the mouth of Jesus was a death sentence for Levi. Not his villa, not his safe place where he could use his wealth to hide his shame, but the very epicenter of his greatest sin, the dilapidated home of the brother whose life he had ruined. The blood drained from Levi's face. This wasn't an invitation, this wasn't an honor, this was a trial, a terrible command. Jesus wasn't coming to Levi's comfort. He was forcing Levi to walk directly into his own disgrace in front of the entire world. All of Capernaum held its breath. The real drama was just beginning. The initial shock gave way to a cold, creeping horror. Levi felt his feet were nailed to the roof. He wanted to vanish. He wanted the earth to crack open and swallow him whole. Anything would be better than obeying the command he had just been given. But he couldn't. There was an authority in Jesus' voice, a quiet majesty that allowed no argument. Mechanically, like a man in a trance, Levi began to climb down. Each rung of the makeshift ladder was a step deeper into his own personal nightmare. The humiliation of climbing onto the roof was nothing. The horror of what was to come was 1,000 times worse. When his feet touched the ground, he didn't dare look up. He just stood there, trembling, waiting. Jesus said nothing more. He simply looked at him, and in that gaze, Levi understood there was no escape. And so, the longest walk of Levi's life began. He had to lead Jesus. Not toward the affluent quarter where white villas stood proud in the sun. He had to turn his back on all of that and walk toward the poor, dusty alleys of Capernaum. The crowd, like a single organism, was eerily silent. The whispers and jeers had stopped. They parted, forming a corridor, and then fell in behind, a silent procession. Their silence was more terrifying than their shouts. It was the silence of spectators awaiting a public execution. They wanted to watch. They wanted to witness the moment Levi was forced to confront the consequence of his sin. Every step was agony for Levi. The road he had walked hundreds of times as a conqueror, he now walked as a condemned man. He could feel every pair of eyes on his back like daggers. He could see the homes he had foreclosed on, the faces of the people he had driven to despair. This walk was a psychological torture. It forced him to relive his entire sinful life, one agonizing step at a time. Finally, they arrived. The small, dirty alley. And at the end of it, there it was. The small, ramshackle wooden house where Aaron lived. It was a living monument to Levi's betrayal. He stopped in front of the door. The entire procession stopped with him, keeping their distance, forming a semicircle of judgment. Levi stood frozen. He couldn't move. The air was trapped in his lungs. This was the door he had avoided for years. The door that separated him from the one part of his past that money couldn't erase. Jesus stood beside him silently. He didn't push. He just waited. Levi closed his eyes. He took a single, shuddering breath, trying to summon the last dregs of his courage. He knew he had to do this. He raised his hand. It was shaking so violently he could see it. And then he knocked. Knock, knock, knock. 3 dry, hollow sounds echoing in the dead silence of the alley. It didn't sound like a knock. It sounded like a judge's gavel, announcing that the trial was now in session. The entire world, Levi's world, Aaron's world, the world of Capernaum, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for that door to open. The seconds stretched into an eternity of dreadful anticipation. Then a scraping sound from within. The old wooden door creaked open. Aaron stood there. He was thinner than Levi remembered, and older. His eyes, which had once danced with artistic visions, were now etched with the lines of weariness and worry. Sawdust still clung to his tunic, and his hands were calloused and rough. Aaron's first look at Levi was one of pure shock, which was instantly replaced by a familiar angry fire, a wall of ice built over years of pain. He started to slam the door shut, but then his eyes fell on the man standing beside Levi. He saw Jesus. A flicker of confusion crossed Aaron's face, and then he looked back at his brother. This time, he didn't see Levi the arrogant tax collector. He didn't see Levi the wealthy tycoon. He saw a man who was completely and utterly broken. Levi's face was ashen, his eyes red-rimmed and swimming with unshed tears. His shoulders slumped as if under an invisible, crushing weight. The pride was gone, the confidence was gone. All that remained was raw, naked shame and pain. And the sight of that brokenness did something that all of Levi's gold could never do. It pierced the wall of ice around Aaron's heart. Levi opened his mouth, trying to speak. He had prepared speeches, justifications, promises, but facing his brother's gaze, the words turned to dust in his throat. He couldn't. He just whispered, a shattered sound, barely audible. "Aaron, I I'm sorry." And then, in front of Jesus, in front of Aaron, and in front of the entire watching crowd, Levi did the unthinkable. He knelt. The most powerful, the wealthiest, the proudest man in Capernaum knelt in the dust of a poor alley at the doorstep of the brother whose life he had destroyed. It was not a strategic move. It was an act of total surrender, a wordless confession that he was wrong, that he had failed, that he needed mercy. The crowd was stunned into absolute silence. This was the spectacle they had come to see, and yet now that it was happening, it didn't feel triumphant. It felt strangely sacred. Aaron stood motionless. He looked down at the brother kneeling at his feet. The years of anger, the pain of betrayal, the bitterness of his hard life. It was all still there. But alongside it, a new emotion, one he thought had died long ago, began to stir, a flicker of pity. He didn't rush forward to help Levi up. He didn't say, "I forgive you." That would have been too easy, too false. He just stood there, looking down at his broken brother. A second passed, 2 seconds, an eternity. And then, very slowly, Aaron gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, just a nod. It was not full forgiveness. It was not forgetfulness, but it was acceptance. It was a silent promise that the door was no longer slammed shut. It was permission for a long, painful process of healing to begin. And in that moment, Levi knew it was more than he deserved. That unspoken word of reconciliation was more precious than all the treasures on earth. Aaron's nod was like a key turning a lock, releasing a dam of emotion that had been building inside Levi for years. He remained on his knees, but now he lifted his head. Tears streamed freely down his face, but it was no longer a face of fear. It was a face of immense, soul-shattering relief. He turned, not to Jesus, but to the crowd, to the people who had been his victims, the people who had cursed his name. He looked them straight in the eye, and with a voice that had found a new kind of strength, not the strength of power, but the strength of truth, he spoke. His voice echoed down the alley. "Hear me, all of you in Capernaum. From this day forward, I, Levi, swear before God and all of you that I will give half of all my possessions to the poor of this city." A gasp of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Half. It was an unimaginable fortune. But Levi wasn't finished. He took another breath, his voice ringing with even greater conviction. "And if I have cheated anyone, if I have unjustly taken even a single coin from any of you," he paused, his gaze sweeping over their faces, "I will repay you 4 times over." This time, it wasn't a gasp. It was a stunned, absolute silence. 4-fold restitution. It was the highest form of repentance in Jewish law, reserved for the most profound and sincere acts of remorse. No one was forcing him. No court had ordered it. This was a voluntary declaration, an act that went beyond all expectation. The change was no longer an internal feeling. It was a public, actionable, and costly promise. Only then did Levi turn back to Jesus. He didn't need to ask. He didn't need a word of confirmation. He just looked at him with the eyes of a man who had finally found freedom. Jesus smiled. It was a smile that wasn't just on his lips. It shone from his eyes. He placed one hand on Levi's shoulder and one hand on Aaron's, drawing the 2 brothers together. And then he looked out at the crowd and spoke the words that would be remembered forever. "Today," his voice rang out full of authority and grace, "salvation has come to this family." He didn't say to this house, he said to this family. He wasn't just saving an individual, he was mending a broken relationship. He was restoring what had been lost. And then the true feast began. It wasn't the lavish banquet with wine and roasted meats in Levi's villa. Jesus stepped over the threshold into Aaron's tiny, cramped home. The smell of pine wood and honest sweat filled the air. He sat at the simple wooden table Aaron himself had built. He asked for nothing. He simply took the piece of bread that was left on the table, held it up, gave thanks, and broke it. He handed one half to Levi and the other half to Aaron. And there, in the golden light of the setting sun, The three of them, a teacher from Nazareth, a tax collector despised by his city, and a carpenter with a broken heart, shared a piece of bread. It was the most beautiful, the most meaningful, and the most luxurious feast Capernaum had ever witnessed. Our camera slowly pulls back, leaving that peaceful image behind. The image of a story that has been rewritten, a story that ends not with wealth, but with reconciliation. Not in a palace, but in a family. Not with a banquet, but with a single piece of broken bread. The story of Levi and Aaron isn't just a story from 2,000 years ago. It's our story, right here, right now. We all have walls we've built. Walls of pride, of fear, of past hurts. And perhaps, in every one of our lives, there is an Aaron's door. It might be the door to a friend you've wronged, the door to a parent you haven't spoken to in years, or maybe it's the door to your own heart, where you've locked away mistakes and regrets you don't dare to face. The question this story leaves us with is not, is there hope for me? The question is, am I brave enough to take my own longest walk, to stand before the door I fear the most, and to knock? Because grace, true forgiveness, often doesn't find us in the comfortable palaces of our self-righteousness. It waits for us in the broken places, in the moments where we dare to be humble, dare to face the truth, and dare to say, I'm sorry. If this story has touched something in your heart tonight, if it has made you think about the Aaron's door in your own life, then that is why our channel exists. We believe that stories like this have the power to change, to heal, and to bring hope. So, I invite you to hit that subscribe button and join our community. Each week we explore another story, another moment of scandalous grace and profound transformation. Don't miss the next one, because you never know, it might just be the story that was written for you.